Sometimes you take a photo, the conditions were good, everything was easy for your camera to handle, and what you get straight out of camera is almost ready to be shared. But there are also many times when it's quite the opposite. You walk the streets during a moody blue hour, or maybe your Sunday hikes bring you to a forest bathed into beautiful angle light. You take a photo with a smile on your face, and you spend the rest of the day looking forward to seeing it on a bigger screen. But then disappointment comes in. Your shot looks nothing like what you saw and felt when you took it, and maybe you're even considering deleting the file. But that would be a big mistake. It's not you messing up your settings or exposure, and it's most probably not a camera problem. Everything is there available on your file. It's just that blue hour scenes and harsh contrast in the forest are simply trickier to edit, and that's what I want to focus on in this video. Today I'm partnering up with Lightroom to show you how to bring your vision to life, and we'll use both basic and more advanced editing features to balance your photos, stylize them, and even clean them up. But with all the new and improved features available in Lightroom, you'll see that it's really not that complicated. So let's jump in. Like I said, when I first looked at this picture straight out of camera on my computer, it was so far from what I envisioned in the field that I kind of struggled to start to edit. And that's typically when you could open your photo in Firefly, which is now available directly from Lightroom. You just have to right-click on the photo, look for Generate using Firefly, and choose Start a Mood Board. Firefly is a creative space that helps you create and edit images, videos, audio, and even vector graphics from simple text prompt. It uses AI to do all these things, and I know that for us photographers, it can be a fine line to balance when we value true, real, and authentic photography. But here I'm simply going to show you how I used it to find some inspiration before editing the actual photo that I took by myself and that I will edit by myself. So the mood board is created with my unedited photo as a starting point, and the first thing I do is look for reference in the Adobe stock library. I enter keywords like silhouette and blue and quickly find a few images that resemble what I had in mind. The subjects are not identical, but it's the visual style I'm looking for. This silhouetted forest at night has nice colors and the contrast I want. This church isn't blue, but it's a good silhouette of a landmark, just like my photo. And these layered mountains in the clouds are another useful reference for the atmosphere. Based on all of that, I asked Firefly to give me an example of what my image could look like once edited. I'm really not particularly good at prompting because it took me 2 attempts to get something convincing. And of course, this is only a visual reference. The colors and the contrast are not exactly what I want, and the hue of the blue tones isn't perfect, but it's good enough to give me a direction. Let's go back to Lightroom now, and before I even start editing, you can see that my background is white, and I prefer this over a gray or even a darker background because white gives me just a reliable brightness indicator. Because when you edit in a dim environment with a dark interface, it's just easy to spend a lot of time on a photo without even realizing that it's way too dark. Then maybe the next day when you're about to post it, you finally notice it and you have to readjust the brightness all over again. I start this edit by making sure that I'm using the Adobe color profile, which is my go-to. Then I move to the white balance and bring the temperature and tint down just a smidge to lean further into that blue hour look. This photo, and like basically all the photos I take, is a raw file full of data, and with raw file I have full control over the white balance. And really I think that the white balance should be the base of your edits affecting colors, because you're not just covering up or tweaking the colors on a superficial level. With white balance you're readjusting the starting point of your file. After that I slightly increase the exposure and make the first drastic change with the shadow slider. I bring it down quite a lot to start creating the silhouette. I also bump up the whites just a touch to inject a little brightness. The present sliders play a big role in my editing philosophy as well. I lower the clarity to make the image softer and more organic, and I also move the dehaze into the negatives to add a bit of mystery. That brightens and softens the image, which goes slightly against what I just did with the shadows, but we'll fix that now with the masks. And I don't typically add masks this early in my editing process, but for this photo, I already know that they'll have a major impact on the final look, so it's better to put them earlier in the editing process. First, I select the sky, and as you can see, the mask also includes a bit of the pagoda, so I subtract it by using the Select Object tool. It's very easy and does such a clean job. Now with only the sky selected, I increase the exposure slightly and add some saturation to start building the richness in the colors. Then I duplicate and invert the mask, and this gives me the exact opposite selection, the pagoda, the houses, and basically all the darker parts that I want to push further into the silhouette. So I lower the exposure, shadows, blacks and whites until the foreground becomes much darker and less detailed. After that, I can exit the mask tool and I switch to the calibration panel, which is where you can almost reshape the color science of your photo. A bit similar to white balance, calibration affects the color at a very fundamental level, so you can make subtle or actually very dramatic changes without immediately making the image fall apart. So I move the blue primary hue towards aqua and increase its saturation. Then I push the green primary hue towards the right and add a small saturation bump. This shifts the overall palette closer to what I want, makes the image richer, and helps the blue and aquas to blend together more naturally. Next is the tone curve. I don't do anything drastic here. I just lift the midtones and upper midtones slightly to add brightness while keeping the very brightest parts almost unchanged. Then I place 2 anchor points in the shadows before lifting the black point to create some fade. I think it works well on this image. It makes it feel a bit more filmic, but it also helps remove even more detail and distraction from the darkest part of the silhouette. I also make some small adjustments to the green and blue curves. I add a little green from the midtones all the way to the highlights. Then I anchor the middle of the blue curve and raise the endpoint to add more blue to the brightest areas. So we are still not done working on the colors, and I move to the color mixer now. And you can see that I'm building the look one layer at a time. There aren't really any reds, oranges or purples in this photo, so I can focus entirely on aqua and blue. My goal is to blend these tones a bit better, so I move aqua towards blue and blue very slightly towards aqua, with the stronger adjustment happening on the aqua slider. The luminance section of the color mixer is especially important because you control the brightness of each color and you can decide how rich or heavy that color feels in the image. Saturation also matters, of course, but if you're really particular about your colors, you definitely shouldn't ignore the luminance section. So we are done with the color mixer now, and I've been talking about the faded blacks and a filmic look, so just makes sense to add quite a bit of grain to this photo. The amount slider controls how much grain you see, but size and roughness define its shape and texture. Here I make it larger and rougher, so it looks more obvious. And last but not least, I clean up the frame to make it more minimal. I don't like these antennas popping out of the houses, and there's also the Kyoto tower in the background and this car reflection in the foreground. And for such straightforward removals, I could use more simpler tools, but generative remove works so well and it lets me select several distractions in one go, so it's just easier like that. As you can see, I just had to choose a better variation for the Kyoto tower, like removal, and then I also had to update my masks since I created them before cleaning up the frame. I realized that I also forgot to crop and level the image, so I do it last, but usually I do it much earlier in the process. And for vertical photos, I like using the 4:3 aspect ratio, and when you press O on your keyboard, you can cycle through different like crop overlays, and I like this simple cross when I'm working with a very centered composition, and yeah. Here's the final image. So that's the before and after, and now it finally looks much closer to how the scene felt when I took the shot. Let's move on to the second image that I took during a family hike in Switzerland. The scene in real life looked absolutely magical, but when I look at the edited photo now, it's really nothing like what I experienced. It's very contrasty, very harsh, and it almost hurts my eyes looking at it now. But we can fix that, and I'll try not to repeat everything from the first edit, so I'll mainly focus on what I do differently here. This time I start by cropping the image. I did not forget. The crop slightly rebalances the composition towards the right and gets rid of some distraction in the bottom left corner, and there are still a few plants catching the light down there, but I remove them at the end. Next I move to the white balance and make the image warmer, and one thing that can ruin your forest shots is auto white balance if you use it. When your camera sees that much green, it may try to compensate by pushing the tint towards magenta, which can just completely change the atmosphere. Personally, I always shoot in a daylight white balance, so it was not a problem here, but still I moved the tint a little bit more towards green to bring back the mood I remember. Then I rebalance the shot with the exposure and tone sliders. I lower the exposure slightly, then start fixing the harsh contrast by lifting the blacks quite a lot. And I like lifting the blacks because it opens up the darker parts of the photo more globally without revealing too much like individual detail. The image doesn't suddenly become HDR, but the shadows feel much less heavy. It's only after lifting the blacks that I raise the shadows slightly to reveal just a bit more information. Then I bring the whites down quite aggressively to soften these like brightest areas and this harshness. The presence sliders again play an important role on this photo. I lower the texture and clarity to remove that harsh, overly sharp feeling from the original image. Then I move dehaze into the negatives to complement the lifted blacks and make the whole photo feel softer and airier. And honestly, at this stage, we already have a decent looking image. Most of the harshness is gone, and we are getting closer to this airy, mystical atmosphere I experienced on the mountain. And to finish in the basic panel, I increased the vibrance to start blending up the colors. But still, I didn't want to stop here, and I wanted to push this image further, so I moved to the calibration panel, and I want more saturation and richness overall, but my main goal here is to make the greens feel fresher and a bit more like true forest greens. That's why I moved the green primary hue towards the right side. Then I move to the tone curve and create a very slight S-curve. I lower the white point to reduce the harshness even more, while keeping the midtones and upper midtones quite bright. Now it's time to fine-tune the individual colors, and for this photo I start with a tool I don't use very often, point color. Usually I don't like to get very specific with my colors because it's easy to make an image fall apart when you go too deep into tiny adjustments. But when I use this point color feature, I mainly use it to access this variance slider. And once you select a color, variance lets you either blend nearby colors together or actually separate them further. And most of the time I use it for blending colors, and here I want less separation between the yellows and greens. It's a subtle change, but I think it makes quite a big difference. Then I switch to the standard HSL controls and make small adjustments, mainly to the orange, yellow, and green. As you can see, I actually lower some of the saturation, and I often like to go slightly overboard with the calibration, with the vibrance and the saturation first, and then dial the individual colors back more precisely with the HSL. After that, I move to color grading and add a touch of purple to the shadows. Purple is opposite to green, and I think it adds depth while helping the greens in the midtones and highlights stand out even a little bit more. Then I add some warmth to the midtones to lean further into that golden angled light look. And finally, a smidge of green to the global wheel to wrap this image around with just a little bit more green. Now moving on to the masks, and I first create a nicely feathered linear mask over the bottom left corner, and I lower the exposure to make that area a bit less distracting. Then I use a luminance range mask, and I don't use this tool very often, but here it's a good way to target a very specific range of shadows and darken them even further without affecting the rest of the image. We are now approaching the end of the edit, and I move to the detail panel and I reduce the sharpening very slightly, because photos, when they are imported to Lightroom, they have a standard amount of sharpening applied by default. Usually it's like 40, and most of the time I leave it untouched, but I think for this photo, with all the foliage and the initial harshness we had, I think reducing it a little bit helps the photo. Then I use the remove tool to clean up some distractions in the foreground, and as you can see, the more traditional remove tool without the generative AI does the job perfectly fine here. And after all that, I still feel like the image is a bit too contrasty, but instead of going back into the intricate details of the tone curve or adjusting like 5 different sliders, I simply return to the contrast slider, which I had left untouched until now, and I lower it just a little until the image feels more balanced. And here is the final before and after. I think it looks much better and much closer to how I remember the scene just before eating a cheese fondue on top of the mountain. So I hope this was helpful, and thanks to Lightroom for this partnership opportunity. And you know what you have left to do? Download Lightroom and make some magic with your photos. Bye.